Hello everyone. In this video, I'll share a recipe for a Dubai cake and show you how to make an extraordinary velour. If you're interested, keep watching. For the sponge cake, we'll need the following ingredients: eggs and sugar. Ideally, of course, brown sugar is best, but regular white sugar will work as well. You need to beat the eggs with the sugar until you get a fluffy, airy, pale mixture. Measure out the milk chocolate and butter. Use high-quality chocolate. Add vegetable oil. I'm using sesame oil. Melt the chocolate together with the butter and vegetable oil until it's warm enough for the chocolate to melt. While continuously mixing on low speed, pour in the melted chocolate with the butter and vegetable oil. Mix everything until smooth. You don't need to beat it for long. Precisely measure out all the necessary dry ingredients and carefully sift them thoroughly into a bowl. I use a whisk to mix everything until smooth. At the end, I mix again with a spatula. Of course, you can bake one tall sponge cake, for example, 20 centimeters in diameter, and it will turn out quite high. But I don't recommend baking a tall sponge cake. In that case, the baking time increases and there's a risk that the sides of the sponge will start to, not exactly burn, but dry out too much. And the center can also start to dry out. That's why I took 3 pans, each 16 centimeters in diameter, and divided all the batter between them. Since this batter contains a lot of chocolate and butter, the mixture turns out quite heavy. To prevent a dome from forming during baking, be sure to cover each pan with foil. Bake at 160 degrees for about 25 minutes. But of course, the baking time depends on the thickness of the batter and the diameter of the pan. That's why I always check for doneness with a dry skewer. While the sponge cake is baking, you can prepare the ganache at the same time. Measure out heavy cream with 35% fat and add invert syrup. Measure out the milk chocolate. The cream should be heated to about 85 degrees and poured over the chocolate. Let it sit for about 5 minutes. Then add pistachio paste and butter. Blend everything with an immersion blender until it forms an emulsion. Pour it into a container and cover with plastic wrap. Any ganache needs to set for about 10 hours. But if you want the ganache to set faster, you need to pour it into a container in a thin layer. The thinner the layer, the faster it will set. By this time, the sponge cakes are ready, so take them out. This is how they turn out. The top comes out a bit porous. As I mentioned, check for doneness with a dry skewer. Wrap the finished sponge cakes in plastic wrap and also leave them to set, ideally also for about 10 hours. But still, these sponge cakes are ready to work with even after cooling. As long as you didn't bake very tall layers, the sponge cake is very aromatic. When freshly baked, it's quite delicate, but after cooling and setting, it becomes denser because we have a lot of fatty ingredients in the recipe. I cut each sponge cake into 2 layers. Even though there's almost no dome, I always trim the top layer off every cake, every sponge, because the top layer forms a kind of film. I don't like having this kind of film-like crust in the finished cake. I always trim it off so that all the layers are the same. After setting, the ganache should be firm and dense like this. Beat for a few minutes with a mixer. The mixture becomes light and airy. It's very important not to overbeat it. As soon as the mixture becomes delicate, airy, creamy, dense, and holds its shape well, you can see this visually. That's it. Stop. Don't beat any longer. Place the sponge cake into the mold. Spread a layer of whipped ganache. On top of the ganache, I place a crunchy layer of kataifi dough with pistachio paste. I have a video on my channel showing how to make this crunchy layer. I'll leave the link in the description. Next, another sponge layer, then ganache. And so I assemble it layer by layer. You can add the crunchy layer to every layer or alternate, add it to one layer, skip it in the next. That's entirely up to you. Since we're using a crunchy filling that doesn't like moisture, it's important to use cake layers and creams that aren't wet. For example, a cream with cream cheese isn't suitable, as it releases moisture and the crunchy layer will quickly become soft and lose its crunch. The same goes for the sponge cake. You need to use a sponge that doesn't require soaking. If we soak the sponge cake, it will also release moisture and the crunchy layer will become less and less crispy with every minute, every hour. After assembling the cake, I put it in the fridge to set. The ganache has set, stabilized, and the cake is now stable. Next, we need to smooth it out. For smoothing, of course, you can use any buttercream or ganache. Since the cake is stable, I don't use a concrete ganache with cocoa butter. There's no need. I just use a buttercream with chocolate. You just need to smooth it out, seal it, and then put it in the freezer, since we'll be covering it with velvet spray. Maybe some of you are already familiar with this velvet spray, or maybe some are seeing it for the first time. For this velvet spray, we'll need gelatin. Soak it in cold water and leave it to swell. Measure out the white chocolate and condensed milk. Heat the condensed milk with the chocolate until warm. Mix until smooth. Next, add coloring as desired or as needed. A big advantage of this velvet spray is that we can use water-soluble colorants. Usually only fat-soluble colorants are used, but since here we use gelatin with water and condensed milk, regular water-soluble colorants are suitable, but fat-soluble ones will also work. Add the swollen melted gelatin. I'm not the author of this recipe. I just saw it and decided to give it a try. Yes, the recipe is very inexpensive to make, but there are some nuances in its use. I wouldn't say it's perfectly convenient. There are all sorts of little things you need to keep in mind. Since there's gelatin in the composition, it cools and sets quickly. That's a bit of a downside. We use this kind of velour while it's still quite hot, around 55 degrees, anywhere from 45 to 55 degrees. It's also important to adjust the spray gun nozzle, since this is a rather thicker mixture than cocoa butter and chocolate. So you need to adjust it, make sure the mixture comes out well, and that it forms a crumbly texture. If we're using this kind of velour, the cake must be left in the freezer for about an hour. It needs to be thoroughly chilled. Since we're applying a fairly hot mixture, it's much easier to apply to a mousse cake. Since my cake isn't fully frozen, just slightly frozen and chilled, I apply the coating in 2 or 3 stages because the velour is quite hot and each subsequent layer doesn't form a nice crumbly texture anymore. That's why we put the cake in the freezer, and by that time even the velour mixture itself cools down and stabilizes, and it no longer passes through the spray gun. So I put the cake in the freezer, take the mixture out of the spray gun, reheat it so it's about 55 degrees, and continue applying it to the cake. Here you can see that the mixture is no longer liquid, it's already quite thick. And it simply can't, that's it. It just doesn't go through the spray gun anymore. So if we're making a regular sponge cake that isn't frozen solid, keep in mind that you'll need to reheat this mixture during the process and apply a second or third layer. When I covered a mousse cake that was frozen solid, everything went much faster because I didn't need to put the cake back in the freezer. It was so cold that I could apply a large amount of this velvet spray, and it created a very beautiful crumb texture. The advantage of this velvet spray is that it's inexpensive. Another advantage is that if your cake is uneven, this kind of velvet spray will hide various small holes and imperfections. You can easily cover up anything you need to hide. This type of velvet spray doesn't crack. You can color this velvet spray with both fat-soluble and water-soluble dyes. I also consider this a big advantage, but the downside, of course, is that you have to work quickly, you need to heat the mixture, and each time you reheat it, it gets thicker. You also can't heat it for too long. Just warm it up very minimally. If you overheat it, it becomes gel-like and it's already hard for it to pass through the spray gun. So if you have any leftovers, I don't recommend saving them and using them again later. They're already inconvenient to work with. I throw away the leftovers and make a fresh batch next time. Next, I will decorate the cake with buttercream in the lambada style. Here you can do as you truly like, but since beautifully decorated cakes with elegant crowns and sparkling glitter are incredibly trending right now, I also decided to make one myself too. And the exquisite lambada cake itself, I truly believe it will undoubtedly stay in popular trend for a very long time to come. Personally, for me, the elegant lambada style will most probably always remain in vogue and highly fashionable because it's quite delicate and refined, incredibly beautiful and visually appealing, and wonderfully festive and celebratory. Ideally, you shouldn't store a cake with Dubai chocolate flavor for too long. Assemble it, smooth it out, decorate it, and at most keep it until the next day. This way, the crunchy layer stays as crispy as possible, since it absorbs moisture and becomes less crunchy with each passing day. Next, we cut the cake. When the cake is just out of the fridge, it takes a bit of effort to cut it since we have a crunchy layer inside. Even though the cake itself is delicate, the crunchy layer makes it a bit harder to slice smoothly. I think the cut looks very beautiful. A small downside of this composition is that the crunchy layer is quite crumbly and doesn't hold together. That's why such a tall cake should be placed on a board right away and cut in this position. If you use high quality ingredients, the taste of the cake really resembles the flavor of Dubai chocolate. That's why I added sesame oil to the sponge cake. These are the subtle yet significant little nuances that truly and profoundly enhance the overall delightful flavor of everything. If you don't want to make the Dubai cake, I think you should definitely add this sponge cake recipe to your collection, because you can make this sponge with white chocolate, dark chocolate, or milk chocolate. Just change the chocolate and you create a new cake flavor. The sponge cake is very convenient. It's very easy to make and everyone can do it. There aren't any special tricks or nuances you need to follow for this sponge cake to turn out. The ganache is also very convenient for any cake, but for this ganache we can't substitute the chocolate. Everything here is calculated for milk chocolate. The velvet coating is just perfect for preventing the cake from cracking. You can apply this kind of velvet coating to any surface. The most important thing is that the surface is frozen. Any frozen cake, any cream will be well covered with this velvet coating. Thanks to the red-haired girl who shares her experiments and recipes for free for this recipe. If you like the video, give it a like, subscribe, comment, and hit the bell so you don't miss new videos, recipes, and experiments. It's easy for you and it makes me happy. Goodbye, everyone.